Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
I think that when we do ethical reflections, doing everything in sort of secular or sort of academic language, rather than thinking about theological issues, I think is a mistake. I think there needs to be funding for a new sector of technology like in India that is targeting communities of faith. I think that in developing products at a place like Microsoft, we need to think not just about, for example, the educational sector, but we should also think about the faith sector. Like how do products like Teams, TikTok, serve the needs and the pace of that kind of thing.
Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gilad Berenstein, and I'm a proud founding member of AI and Faith. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by a brilliant guest who is deep in the world of AI, academia, and of course, faith. And in today's conversation, we're going to focus on a topic that's a bit complex, but is near and dear to my heart, and that's the epistemology of technology, and specifically how AGI and other technologies come together with values of communities of faith and how we can bring these values together to bring a world that is beneficial for all of us. And I'm very excited to have a wonderful guest joining me for this conversation today. So please help me welcome Glen, and let's have him introduce himself and tell us a bit about his interest in the world of AI.
Hey, Gilad, thanks so much for having me here. I'm at Microsoft. I run a group called the Plural Technology Collaboratory, but I have a background as an economist, as well as in the Jewish and some other faith traditions. And I work on the intersection between technology and sort of cooperation more broadly, but especially issues around democracy and large-scale social organization.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for being involved with AI and faith. So my first question, the area I really want to focus on for most of our conversations is the intersection. And, an area you're really interested in is the inclusion of people of faith and their perspectives in the technology discourse. And often we find that is not necessarily happening, especially in the West. So maybe you can start by telling us a little bit of what does that look like? Where do these values converge? And why do you not think that we're aligning closer together between the two communities?
Well, I grew up in Silicon Valley. I know you've spent a lot of time there. The atmosphere there when I was growing up was very hostile to religion. There was a very strong feeling that, religion should not come up in tech circles, or if it did come up, it was more these tech religions where you worship various directions for the future of technology, whether that be AGI or, some crypto world, et cetera. And I came to feel through my experiences reflecting on my own faith and also through my encounters with other cultures where that works differently, that was really a source of dysfunction. It was a source of these hype cycles. It was a source of the clash that so often exists between the aspirations of the tech world and the rest of society. And I've come, therefore, to believe that a critical solution to this is to bring communities of faith and their ways of thinking about things to be more central to the way that we think about the directions of technology.
Amazing. And of course, that view aligns very well with what we're trying to do here at AI and Faith, which is why you are such a perfect member of our community. And as you've done some of these conversations in your own life, what are some areas where you feel like there's more natural alignment, where this might be easier? And what are areas where you think maybe the alignment is going to be more difficult to achieve?
Well, I think that, there are approaches to technology that fit in very well with religious sensibilities. One, that I think is really important is complexity science. So complexity science and thinking about networks and about these more integrative, the ways in which technology connects people and allows people to communicate, those perspectives tend to, I think, cohere quite well with religious sensibilities. Some of the more sort of messianic and tech-focused visions, whether it be AGI discussions or discussions around doing away with governments, doing away with religions, doing away with sort of collective organizations and replacing them with cryptographic protocols and so forth, I think tend to be in a lot more tension. You see in societies like Japan and India, where religion is much more integrated into the social fabric, much more emphasis, I think, on those sort of pluralistic, integrative, collaborative visions of technology, and less on these kind of extreme visions.
That makes perfect sense. And do you have any hypotheses for why it is in certain societies that these perspectives are so much more integrated into society? Is it something about level of religiosity, or is it something about lack of religious diversity, or is it something else?
It's interesting because both of those factors seem to cut across these Asian societies. So you take somewhere like India, where there's basically two major religions, and one is
Yeah,
dominant in Hinduism, and you see that very tight integration. It's also a very, very deeply religious society. You go to somewhere like Japan, where almost everyone is some mixture of Shinto and Zen Buddhist. There's almost no religious diversity, and there's not a lot of religious observation either.
yeah,
And you also see a strong integration between faith and even the like loose cultural faith and technology. And then in somewhere like Taiwan, which is observant but extremely religiously diverse, perhaps you see the greatest integration between technology and faith. So it seems to be something that's shared across all those different Asian contexts and divergent from the West. And I think maybe that has to do with kind of the history of how science developed in the West in sort of conflict with the church, and how that
yeah.
then spread to institutions and other religious traditions in the West. Whereas, in Asia, that was never really the case. There was always kind of an integration between faith and the development of science and technology. Probably it goes back to that. But I think that it's somewhere that we have a lot to learn because, in Taiwan, for example, you've got about 20% of the population that's Christian, and even them, don't have this Western conflict between
Yeah.
church and technology.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm trying to think about it from my perspective, not as just a Jewish person, but also someone who spent most of my life in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because a lot of the Orthodox community in Israel does accept modern technology, modern science, and engage
Yeah.
with it. But then, of course, there are subsets of the communities that don't. And I was trying to think about like what's the difference within those communities, and I don't have a great answer for
I
that.
would guess, my guess, but I don't know the statistics, but my guess is that the modern Orthodox are as strongly, if not more strongly represented than secular Israelis in the tech world. But is that true, or what do you think?
That's a good question. I have no idea. I'm going to have to look into that. I think that's a really interesting perspective. The other thing is about Judaism's evolution, of course, is rabbis were part of the community and Jewish scholars part of the community. They were
Yeah,
not living in monasteries or living in other places where
right.
some other religions separate their leaders. And thus, rabbis had to often own businesses and provide for families and all sorts of other things, which maybe has something to do with that as
I
well.
also
But
wonder, in Israel, is there like a tech for faith sector the way there is in India? So in India, like The Economist had an article that something like a majority of all the VC money in the tech world is going into tech oriented towards people observing religious traditions and faith, which is crazy,
incredible.
you know?
Yeah,
And I don't
no,
know if that shows up in Israel for the ultra-Orthodox community or even the modern Orthodox community, or what the dynamics there are.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there are certainly not many VCs in a place like Jerusalem, but I think this actually might not be a good answer to a great
Yeah,
question because it might be that the funding market within these small, tight-knit communities is much more opaque than it
yeah,
is in broader communities. So it's possible
yeah.
there's a lot of funding happening more person to person than it is kind of VC to company, and maybe that's actually harder for us to see. So this is really interesting stuff for us to dig into.
Yeah,
Now, a couple minutes ago, you talked about tech religions or AI religions, which
yeah,
is actually something that I think a lot about. So maybe we'll
yeah.
start maybe define what you mean when you use that term.
Yeah, there's these movements like effective altruism, network state, and transhumanism, and so forth. And there's a nice book by someone who I don't know if it's been on your show. His name is Greg Epstein. I actually saw him earlier today. And also Megan. They all write about sort of these movements talking about AGI, talking about, the way that it could bring an end of the world or transcendence and so forth, and that have formed very strong sort of moral communities, social groups that spend a lot of time with each other around them, and that I think effectively serve both in the epistemological, the ethical, and also the community-based role, kind of the role that a religion plays for many other people in society. And they're very separated, from the rest of the society. They sort of have a social structure that's something like a cult might have in a more religious
Yeah.
tradition. And because those are kind of not only permitted, but actually quite mainstreamed within a lot of the frontier tech world, and yet religious discourse is so sidelined, they kind of almost have the status of an official faith for a lot of the tech world in a way that I think is interesting, and especially given how central tech is to shaping so much of our society is very influential.
That's a great summary and a great definition. And certainly from my experience, effective altruism certainly felt a lot like a religion for some of the people
Yeah.
who are really enjoyed participating in it and had, idols and all sorts
Yeah.
of different people. That's really interesting. So I'm writing my first short story since grade school, probably whenever we stopped being told to
Wow,
write short
cool.
stories. And it's about an AI religion. Now, I took it from a slightly different perspective where the story is exploring this AI bot that these kind of different people come to in different ways. And the bot is sharing wisdom or advice or insights or whatever. And the story tries to explore, is this bot divine or godlike
I
in
see.
some way? And obviously some of the people interactive in the story think so, and some people interactive in the story are not so sure. And I started writing it because, at the end of the year last year, a bunch of journalists reached out to me for kind of like, like your roundup of like predictions for AI in 2025.
Yeah.
And by the last one, I was clearly like just too tired to give any more business predictions. And I said, well, we're going to see the rise of the first AI religion in 2025. And then, of course, that got more shares than any of the other stuff I talked about on the business side of things. So I've been trying to explore what that might look like. And I guess if you come across any AI religions, and do you have an instinct of, do you think we're going to see these kinds of things, or are you thinking about too far off?
I'm not anywhere near an expert on this, but I do believe there's someone who gives a seminar for AI and faith precisely about, she's like a sociologist documenting the emergence of these kinds of things. So I'm sure she'd have a lot more to say than I would about this.
Amazing. Well, that gives us a great new episode we'll have to add to our season coming up at some point.
But I think, I don't think you have to literally be worshiping a particular AI system to be part of an AI religion. I mean, Jews, for example, don't believe that a Messiah has yet come to the earth, but believe one may come, or at least some Jews do. And they believe in a God that does not usually manifest in physical form. So I think it's possible to hold beliefs like that without having to have seen a manifestation of it yet. And I think, in a lot of the talk about the coming AGI and how that will be either the salvation or the end of mankind, and that, the way that shapes the behavior of some people within the sort of AI community and the, EA world and rationalism and so forth, I think it has a lot of that character to it.
Yeah, I really want to go off on this tangent for the rest of the episode, but I'm going to rail us back in because this is an important topic for people of faith and for all of us to be paying attention to, because it's very likely to play a role in our lives coming forward. But bringing us back to kind of India and Japan, where we spoke about it a few minutes ago, you've mentioned both on our podcast and in conversations we had before that technologies in the West don't always serve the needs of religious communities, whereas technologies in India and other places do much more so. Are there any examples you can share with us of how they do that in the East?
Yeah, so I'm nowhere near an expert on this, but I'll give a few examples. India, there have been a bunch of technologies that help people remotely observe festivals. So like think about either VR or even just like a video game where you are navigating a spiritual terrain and going through virtually some kind of a journey, whether it be like the Hajj, or whether it be a pilgrimage, exploring a temple, living through a religious epic and learning spiritual lessons from that. And in Japan, there's this sort of animist vision where everything has a spirit. And one, use I've seen a lot for immediate thought that many Japanese people coming from that tradition have about what AI could be used for, sometimes called uplifting. It's the notion of allowing you through an LLM to have a conversation or interaction verbally with non-human objects. I often call it Lorax.ai. So like you have some conversation with the environment or some conversation with a part of a physical supply chain for some commodity like sushi or something like that, because there's meant to be respect for those things. And people show that through ritual, but could you do that actually through language now that these affordances are available?
I love that. These are great examples. And as we think about maybe closing the gap in the West and having technology created for religious communities here, what are some ways to close the gap? I mean, like I could think about, is it the people of faith need to be more entrepreneurial in starting companies? Is it that people of faith working in large companies need to do more? Is it something about funding or something else altogether?
I mean, I think probably all of the above. I mean, so you can even think about the different functionalities of a large company. So like from an HR perspective, the DE&I conversation has almost exclusively focused on dimensions like race, gender, background in terms of income, but religious observance really has not shown up in there. And the
Yeah.
thing that's interesting is it's one of the only dimensions that correlates with almost all the others. Women, people of color, people from the global south are much more observant than are white men from the global north.
Yeah.
And yet that hasn't shown up, even though for most of those people, actually, their faith is a more important dimension of their identity than are these other personal characteristics. So I think there needs to be an opening and a shift of emphasis to think about these things that actually more profoundly affect how we approach the world. I think that when we do ethical reflections, doing everything in sort of secular or sort of academic language rather than thinking about theological issues, I think is a mistake. I think there needs to be funding for a new sector of technology like in India that is targeting communities of faith. I think that in developing products at a place like Microsoft, we need to think not just about, for example, the educational sector, but we should also think about the faith sector. Like how do products like Teams, TikTok, serve the needs and the pace of that kind of thing. So I could go on and on and on. I think
Yeah.
it's politically true, geopolitically true. I think in all these dimensions, we need to engage with the role that faith plays.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite things that you said, which is so true, but I actually haven't heard many people say out loud, is that for most people, especially people of faith, their faith affiliation is going to be a much bigger determinant of their lives than maybe their gender or their race or
Yeah,
some other characteristics, especially ones that are much shallower than one level of faith. I think that's a really important point. The only thing I would add to your list is I think organizations of faith need to create grant opportunities for technology.
absolutely.
Obviously, we have grant opportunities for lots of other things of doing good work in the world. But at the end of the day, that is one of the ways you get entrepreneurs to even notice a new sector that
Yeah.
they don't even know exists is by giving them the funding to do something. And I don't know exactly the right way to go about that, but that's
Well,
something that I
I have
certainly
an
think.
even more concrete thing than that, which is
Yeah.
that most religious organizations spend a significant amount of money on various kinds of publications and communications, right? For example, my daughters, I'm Jewish, get regular books from something called PJ Library, which helps educate them about Jewish traditions. You're smiling. I guess your
I'm
children
smiling.
do as well.
Yeah, my children get it too, and we're
I
very
just read
fortunate.
some of them to the kids in my girls' class this morning for Purim. So
Yeah, and I'll give a shout out. Our neighbors here in Seattle, they know who they are. Some of the
yeah,
biggest donors in the world to PJ Library, and
yeah. Well,
have really
God bless them.
reinvigorated the children's publishing industry within the Jewish community. And that's exactly the type of example. I love that example you use that we need to use in other sectors of faith.
Yeah. And so let me give an example of a direction I think it would be great if this could go. We're working on this is in my job at Microsoft, we're working on a sort of redesign for social media. And we imagine that more of a role rather than for advertisers would be taken by communities that want to
Yeah.
steer the direction of conversation to something that brings their community together. And rather than just grants, you could imagine communities of faith being funders there to help bring together the community of Jews or the community of Catholics or whoever in a particular geography, rather than just advertising at them to actually steer the algorithm to up-regulate content that brings people together.
Amazing. Now, before we run out of time, I want to talk about your book for a few minutes. I started reading it a couple days ago, and I'm very excited to get a little bit deeper. So maybe start with telling us a little bit about the book, how it came together. Obviously, tell us a bit about your co-author.
So the book is called Plurality, or Digital Shui Plurality, the future of technology and democracy, the future of collaborative technology and democracy. And it's joint with a woman named Audrey Tong, who is the first digital minister of Taiwan, now their cyber ambassador, and also the first gender non-binary minister in the world. She's also a Taoist and a very spiritual person, and really one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. We wrote the book as a global open source, democratically participatory collaboration. So we had dozens of people around the world participate in it. And it tells the story of how technology can be oriented towards a future, not of sort of the machine doing everything for you or us all being sort of on our own in some, anarcho-capitalist crypto world, but rather how technology can help bring us together across our differences to collaborate while maintaining those differences. So it's like really inspired by kind of the religious pluralist tradition that underlies groups like AI and faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've begun to get feedback from readers, what seems to
Yeah.
be resonating, or where are people maybe having different perspectives than you guys have?
The thing that's been remarkable to me about this book is I wrote another book called Radical Markets 6 years before this one. And that one, lots of people read. It was quite controversial, but because it was controversial, not a lot of stuff really happened directly on the basis of this. This, because we distributed in this weird way, was much more narrowly read, but there was a lot more press engagement, and now there's a lot more like deployments by in public sector settings, especially, but also in private sector ones. So my favorite one is that in Japan, which I mentioned before, where I think there's a lot of resonance, there's been a whole movement to really reimagine how politics works using these technologies. Someone ran for governor of Tokyo and almost won using this sort of crowdsourcing approach and
Wow.
using AIs to synthesize people's views. And he's now head of long-term planning for the Tokyo government, and most of the political parties in Japan have signed on to working with these types of tools. So that's been really cool to see.
That's really interesting. And touching on political people, not politics directly,
Yeah.
have you found that politicians in the East are more open to engaging with technology in the West, or have you not noticed a material difference?
Certainly, there's been an ability to scale things in terms of technology and to sort of bring them in much more rapidly and deeply in the East than in the West, especially in Taiwan and Japan, but also in India and in the US. Maybe it's because we have an older democracy. I think there's a lot more, rigidity to that
Yeah.
process. I think there are places in Europe with more recent democracies where it's been more agile, in Brazil as well, Chile, Argentina. But in the United States, I think we sort of proud of ourselves as a democratic experiment, but have become quite rigid in what that means to us.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's a whole different podcast. That's awesome. I mean, it's one of those things where I give a lot of speeches about AI, especially in the corporate setting, and I talk a lot about how we all have to engage in this conversation right now, especially as the way that it deploys into every element of our lives. And I often tell audiences, if we can go back 20 years and make some different decisions about the way social media was rolled out across the world, I bet most of us would agree that we should make some different decisions about the way
Yeah,
social media was going to be rolled out in the world. And I tell audiences all the time that right now is the 20 years ago for AI. One of the things that I talk about a lot is, a lot of folks think of this era of AI as the Gen AI era. And I like to remind them, I think that's a very short-sighted way of thinking about
yeah,
it. And I like to call this era the great commoditization. And the
yeah,
reason is we started this decade with a very small number of businesses and organizations in the world having access to this technology. And we're going to leave this decade with every single organization on planet Earth using AI, including organizations of faith, and really encouraging audiences to engage with this now so we can all help develop this future coming together. And I love what you're doing, kind of bringing some of these perspectives from the East to those of us living in the West who maybe are not as aware of them.
yeah. No, I think it's a very interesting, exciting, challenging, dynamic moment, and that's why it's so critical that communities of faith engage right now. I have to say, the other day I learned about this organization called the Future for the Family. I don't know if you've heard about this.
I have not.
But it was the first example I've ever seen, and I've grew up in Silicon Valley and followed tech policy since I was 4 or 5 years old, and I've not seen before an organization that was trying to sort of organize religious conservatives to speak about their perspective on tech policy.
I love
Um,
that.
I don't know how, in almost every other area of American life, religious conservatives have something to say. But in
Yeah.
but in technology, that voice has been almost completely absent. The only
Yeah.
representation of the right has been kind of libertarians or, techno
Yeah.
accelerationists or techno
Yep.
supremacists sort of perspective. And I thought that was really exciting to see. And I hope we're going to see more of that in the coming years because we need it at this moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're almost out of time here, but before we go to our lightning round question, you spent a lot of time in the East speaking writing with people from all over the world. If you could leave us with one more lesson, one more takeaway, one more example of something those of us in the West might be able to learn from our friends and neighbors in the East, anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Taiwanese Gov Zero movement, this was a bunch of people from civil society who started kind of downloading government websites, improving on them, and putting them back up online, and then shaming the government into adopting them. So rather than having like, concentrated, one tech person for the government go and do things, it was sort of the hacker community that in public was sort of bringing pressure on the government to improve its digital services. I think that's a great example. And it did, because it was really based in civil society, work with a lot of communities of faith to help organize people around that, I think that's like a really fascinating example.
What an amazing grassroots example. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, before I let you go, we do have a lightning round. 3 questions. You'll have
Love it.
15 seconds per answer. And we're going to kick it off with, what is one of your favorite personal use cases for artificial intelligence?
Well, I use it by far the most to do research. I come from a research background, and it's a great way. If you have to get everything right, Gen AI is not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to ideate and you have plenty of time to check on things afterwards, it's just a fantastic conversational partner. And I can very quickly get a couple days worth of research done in a few minutes using it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I use it very similarly. Okay, next question. What are we not talking enough about in the world of AI?
I think the way in which AI is a representation of all of us and really a new form of democracy, rather than some external agent that we need to either fear or constrain. Like, we need to constrain AI just as much as we need to constrain sort of governments or something like that. It's actually a representation of us. So the real question is, how do you build into its structure something that makes sure that we're all comfortable with those rules of the collective game that it's creating, rather than that it's some sort of alien alternative to us,
I completely love that, and really go back to my point of, that's why we all need to be engaging people of faith, people from all different backgrounds. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then last question, would you personally want access to an AI rabbi or spiritual leader?
I would love to talk about spiritual matters with an AI, but whether it yet has the sophistication to provide that role, or whether it even should, what I'd love even more is sort of an AI that explicitly is kind of bringing together a bunch of people from a community of faith to sort of reflect on things together, to be like a facilitator. And often some of the best rabbis do play that role,
Absolutely.
But rather than necessarily speaking from a position of authority as a rabbi, more of a position of facilitation on collective reflection is what I'd love to see.
I love that. I always think about how much I would enjoy having a conversation with an AI Maimonides or Heschel or some of the great rabbis of the past.
Representations of people who aren't here now, I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Glen, for joining us. It's been an amazing conversation that we got to dive deeper into, but we're so grateful to have you as a part of our community.
Yeah, and Hag Purim Sameach, and also Shabbat Shalom to you.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of the podcast. We look forward to having you with us again soon.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.